Thanks for joining me for another episode of our Project Catalyst podcast series. My name's Kim Kleidon. For more than 15 years, Project Catalyst initiatives have supported progressive growers to trial new ideas, implementing practices that reduce inputs and improve water quality. From the Mackay Whitsunday region through the Burdekin and into Queensland's wet tropics, many of their innovations increased productivity and profitability, whilst being embraced as industry standards of best practice. I sat down in conversation with Project Coordinator Ross Neivandt to learn more about the program, the grower's legacy, the project's future, and what originally attracted him to environmental science.
A lot of the mining studies that you do at tertiary level are all earth sciences, so they're very much related to environment, because you are learning about the environment, the interactions, the development, the evolution. And that opportunity led into some studies that I was doing in two of my degrees that were to do with agricultural land, so bringing agricultural land studies into the field of geology through a little bit of science to do with electromagnetic mapping, which we now do normally, which I did in 1989 on a farm in Victoria, and everyone thought I was nuts.
That was your first interaction with EM mapping?
Yeah, it'll never catch on. Actually, it's 1988. That was at a place called Mount Camel, which was north of Bendigo in central Victoria, on the edge of the Murray-Darling Basin, on the Coleban River. And yeah, it was a property, a grazing property, which had some weird issues going on with water drainage and groundwater. There was just no reason why it occurred in some areas and didn't in others. So I undertook this EM mapping project, and over a year or so figured out what was going on. And it turned out that there was a massive geological fault that went through the local river that exposed all this, a very coarse aquifer in the base of the river, and all the water was just being diverted straight around this farm.
What was the transition like from mining into agriculture?
Well, I actually went the other way. I started in ag and then went into mining and then came back into ag. So the tertiary studies that I did were environmentally focused, so they were hydrogeology. My first degree was as a hydrogeologist. So that's to do with shallow groundwater or any groundwater, but it lends itself to farming and civil work. So my very first job out of university once I graduated was with BSCS in Bundaberg, and that was studying the ISIS district. They were about to open up the ISIS irrigation area, so going from dryland farming to irrigation, and they wanted someone who knew what they were looking at to keep an eye on the groundwater system to observe any impacts that all this irrigation water that had never been in the area before was going to have on those shallow sandy aquifers. And yeah, it was a great project. So I then worked for several years with DPI and BSCS, and then went into corporate land and into mining, and then 25 years later came back out again and back into agriculture.
What was your original connection to the environment, the land, agriculture, from your formative years?
Well, living in regional Victoria, obviously it's a regional setting, so it's very different to living in a major city. And 35 years ago, I mean, yeah, Central Victoria was a very rural area. The background of my family background is mining. My grandfather was a miner. My great grandfather was a miner. My father was an engineer, and I just bucked the system and decided that I had little choice but to study geology, because that's what you did when you lived in Central Victoria, lived in Bendigo. So taking that skill set and working out how you could use it in a modern world was the challenge. And I ended up in Queensland working for BSCS because I was given two alternatives when I finished university. One of them was working with the Victorian Rural Water Commission, and I'd already done a few years of working in the Murray-Darling, so I felt I could probably do something different. And the other opportunity was a research assignment in Antarctica for 4 years, And when you're 22, it's probably the last thing you want to do is go and isolate yourself for 4 years in a place like that. So I ended up moving to Queensland. Originally it was Bundaberg. I worked at the research station in Bundy with Graham Kingston and the team down there, when the SES was still a mighty organisation and a brilliant group to work with. And after that I went private, so I was working for multinational corporations for a couple of years. I was then asked by my clients to take the work on myself for my own businesses, and that meant a move from Bundaberg to Mackay. And I was here in Mackay right up until 18 months ago, when I finally moved back down to Victoria, mainly for family reasons.
How much has Mackay changed since the mid-90s when you came here?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, it's always been that town that's seen, huge influence and benefit from the mining industry being so close with but I've seen the booms and the busts with the housing industry and the mining support industries and that. There's a land of opportunity, of course, but it's also quite fickle. So,
well, agriculture's been here longer than mining. What's your, I suppose, interpretation of the agricultural sector, and particularly the sugar industry in this region?
Obviously, it's the mainstay, and I mean the area wouldn't have been developed without that ag industry behind it. Until the mining areas came along. But it's disappointing to see, I guess, like a lot of all the good ground is now growing houses and all the farming's being pushed out onto the marginal lands. And that's probably the thing I've noticed the most, is that when I moved here, I mean, Paget was almost a separate suburb and almost a separate town, whereas now it's just an extension of the city and there's very little in between. So a lot of that highly productive land is now growing houses, and it makes it challenging for the growers who pin their livelihoods on raising families here and having businesses here, who are constantly challenged by the pressures of urbanisation.
How much did you know about Project Catalyst, for instance, when it began in 2008?
I actually had a bit of an inside run on that, because the woman who's now my wife was one of the people that helped put that together. So Jane worked with the Coca-Cola Foundation and Reef Catchments to bring the original 19 growers in Catalyst together, and she was instrumental in forming that group. And my involvement with that was I was actually a member of Reef Catchments before they were incorporated. So I've had a very close association with Reef Catchments since they first became an organisation, and before. That's where I first met Jane, actually. And then over the time Jane left Reef Catchments, the project continued, and there's been a long-term association, I guess, at arm's length with a lot of these growers, but I've known like Tony and Jerry and that for years. So, and then being given the opportunity 4 years ago to actually come in and manage that project as the coordinator, to step in, and it was a wonderful opportunity because, yes, I had some background, I knew what the project was about, I understood where it had come from, how it had developed, how important it was, the phenomenal support that it has from so many different directions, the interest that it generates and the work that it does. It's an extremely high value project, and it all comes down to the strength of the people that have been involved with it, from the growers right through. So to be offered a position where I could actually help keep Catalyst rolling and possibly look at how we could pivot into other things to preserve the project was a real honour.
What keeps you focused and driven in relation to this project that you obviously see the value in?
What keeps me driven, I guess, is just the fact that I've taken on the challenge of doing my absolute best with making sure that we're delivering what we say we're going to, and that the growers and our supporters are getting what they need, and to attract funders to keep the wheels on, if you like, while our growers are the ones that do the hard work and achieve the results. And I mean, my job is to help celebrate that and to make sure that it's done in a manner that is controlled and accountable. And with my background in managing businesses and people and organisations and navigating legal systems and structures and all that sort of stuff, it's all come together in the challenge of keeping its resilience and seeing where the next opportunities lie for it, because We all know that Catalyst has morphed from what it was originally as an innovation initiative through to where it is now, which is practice change adoption. It's always been my thought with Catalyst that we need to get back to our grassroots, but we also needed to prove that all the wonderful work that had been done by the growers in the past had value and could be applied at scale to the industry for everyone's benefit. And without that opportunity, it really would limit our likelihood of funders looking at us seriously in future and saying, well, we're going to support you, because showing that we could roll the ideas out at scale and the impact they would have on the industry, the positive impacts, that really lends itself to supporting the idea that what we did in the first place was what was really needed at the time. And we're at that point again now where we need to revisit that. So we can't continue to have continuous improvement in the industry without innovation to lead it. So
The Catalyst is proven through its track record of water quality improvement to be one of the leading projects in this field. The presentation that was given in Cairns this year by Coca-Cola through the DENSTAT report, I mean, the people who were there, they sort of understood at the end of that presentation what it meant, but for people who weren't there, I mean, how did you see that report globally positioning this program?
There's no doubt that that report illustrates and confirms that Project Catalyst is one of the highest return on investment projects in the world in this space. There's a lot of projects that haven't been around as long, or maybe they have, but they just haven't had the same passion and drive behind them, haven't had the same level of support. We've been very fortunate that we have had incredible sponsors and supporters who have put their heart and souls into the idea of Catalyst being a global leader in this space of taking the idea that your productivity is linked not only to your livelihood but also to the condition of the environment around you. So if you can improve your farming performance, then you are going to almost certainly improve your environmental performance, and that's obviously has some pretty big implications at a community level. So the DENSTAT report, I was involved from the beginning with that, advising DENSTAT in Belgium about how the project operated, the work that the project had produced, the types of impacts that we'd had, and provided them with the information that they used to develop their own report on it. So they first of all had to work out how they were going to take the ideas and the things that had come out of Project Catalyst. They had to work out what they were, and then they had to work out how they were going to look at them in terms of value. So it was not just a process of plugging numbers into an algorithm and getting an answer out the other end. It was very much them thinking through, because they're the world experts in this field, what can we identify in the work that Catalyst has done where there's value that we can realise. So CO2 equivalents, for instance. So they're looking at, what's the reduction in the CO2 impact from the fact that you're now using less fertilisers than you would, because you're not generating CO2 from producing that fertiliser to start with. So it's a whole chain of things: transport, controlled traffic, it's reduced air, and it's all those things. So they've looked at quite a few of those areas, and there's still work to be done on it. But what they did with our project was they saw that there was so many good things coming out of it in terms of improvements that they could touch and smell and see that were real, that they worked out a way of determining a value for them in terms of dollars as well as savings. So I'm talking about how many dollars of environmental value was contributed by what Project Catalyst has done. So what they came up with was that for every dollar that has been invested in the project, there's been a $5 return in terms of what the value is that's been returned to the community and the environment. And that's a 5-to-1 ROI is a pretty incredible result, and it absolutely dwarfed other projects around the world that operate in a similar space, some of which are supported by Coca-Cola Foundation. But when the original report was produced, Project Catalyst was actually left off the chart, because if they put it on the chart, then everyone else looked too small. So they
wasn't enough page.
No, the graph wasn't tall enough to have Project Catalyst at the top.
Love it.
You're listening to the Project Catalyst podcast and vodcast series with me, Kim Kleidon. Today, I'm in conversation with Ross Neivandt, the Project Catalyst Coordinator and Principal Environmental Scientist with Catchment Solutions in Mackay.
From a Coca-Cola Foundation perspective, they've stuck with the project for 15 years, and that's some sort of commitment. You know, what have they brought to this program?
So Coca-Cola brought the recognition and the underpinning financial support to the project, so that, you know, in the early days it was just Coca-Cola and WWF that were involved, and they invested a large amount of money, and that really woke people up to the fact that, you know, there's something in this innovation thing. If someone like the Coca-Cola Foundation is serious about supporting it to the level that they did in the early days, then, you know, it's got to be something big. It's got to be something worth looking at. And it all came out of Coca-Cola's Replenish program, which isn't well known, but Coca-Cola had a program where they committed to, over a period of time, working towards contributing water back to the environment of an equivalent volume to what they used in their production worldwide. So water of improved quality. And Project Catalyst fitted into what they needed to work in that space, because Project Catalyst is improving the quality of water by reducing contaminants coming off farm through better and more efficient farming.
I think it was every drop counts.
Yeah, an incredible initiative, and I'm surprised that Coca-Cola haven't used it for more promotion than they have, because they basically haven't used it at all. But it's not particularly well known, but it is a massive undertaking. And Project Catalyst was one of the major contributors to them meeting their goals, and they actually achieved those water neutrality goals, as they referred to them as, 3 years ahead of schedule.
The growers are quite humble, and you wouldn't hear many of them, you know, talking themselves up or what they've achieved. From your perspective, what have they achieved?
They've achieved what no one else could have. And we've got to remember that, you know, we can pat our supporters on the back as much as we like, but at the end of the day, none of it would have happened without the growers and their commitment. Their ideas, their passion, their, you know, outside the square approach to things, the camaraderie that the project has created, the safe space to discuss ideas. And
they've always said, you know, no idea is a bad idea. It's just something that may need tweaking to work in other regions.
Yeah, and that's one of the key things about Catalyst is, when it originally started, it was just in Mackay Whitsunday district, and those 19 original growers, many of them are still out there today farming. You know, they had a brilliant opportunity, they seized it, and they did some fantastic work. Some of the practices that we see commonly used in industry today came out of that program. And I'm not saying Catalyst invented the ideas, but it certainly helped refine them and brought them to a point where they could be incorporated into farming systems probably much earlier than they would have been otherwise. But the other strength of Catalyst is that when it was expanded into the other NRM regions, so the Burdekin and the wet tropics, that provided the opportunity to take some of the ideas that have been developed or were being developed in other regions, and seeing how they worked across a broader area. So what I'm saying is that a practice change or an innovation method that might work in Mackay might not necessarily be ideal for application in the wet tropics. Now, whether it's weather or soil types or conditions or varieties, whatever it is, we can't assume that just because there's a new idea that's produced a result that it's going to be useful everywhere. So one of the great things about Catalyst was that it was able to take that next step and do some validation. So we ended up, just before I started, there was over 100 trials and validations going on where ideas were being deployed into different regions, and farmers in those other regions were taking those ideas and working out whether it was something that they could use in their system or whether it was suited to the local environment. And I think that's another really valuable stepping stone for the project, was that it wasn't just the creation of ideas that worked for a particular person in a particular location. They could be demonstrated that some of them could be extended or expanded at scale. One of the immense values is the social and peer-to-peer aspect of the project. We've got growers who come to forum every year who may not see each other so we might see each other once a year or once every 2 years, but they've established these friendships across these regions, and we've got people that never would have met before who are now sharing ideas, and there's a network that exists now of these growers that are not just the innovators, it's the adopters as well. It's the guys that are understanding now that they can, for little or no effort and for reduced costs, they can adopt things on their farm that are going to increase their productivity, save them money, and all that aside, I think one of the most valuable things is there's a network of support there, and we hear all the time from our growers at forum about the best thing about coming to forum is you get to catch up with your mates and think up new crazy things to try and discuss what's worked and what hasn't, and listen to what everyone else has been doing. Be who you are with your own ideas, and you're never going to get shot down. I mean, that doesn't happen anywhere else.
You talked about the changes that have happened within Catalyst, particularly moving from innovation into broad adoption or practice change adoption, which realistically has been led by the funding model from the Australian government and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. And of course, at some point, when you reach enough practice change adoption, you do want more people to actually enjoy those benefits of productivity and profitability, also improving water quality in the environment. From the growers' perspective, however, I know that some of them have felt a little bit abandoned in the innovation space. What is it you think they're not really seeing in relation to the influence they've had on the industry as a whole?
So what we're seeing with the growers in the program at the moment, with the shift into the practice change adoption and the broader adoption, is that we're connecting with a different part of the grower community. Some of those growers are probably not interested in innovation as something that they would undertake themselves, whether it's through the pressures of running the farm or maybe that's just not their bent. But what we're seeing is that we're getting quite a number of growers that are coming into the program that are excited about it, who are taking the time and effort to actually be part of the practice change adoption programs, and are completely surprised by the results that they're seeing. And those results partly come from the work that the project's done previously to develop those very practice changes that are now becoming a normal part of modern farming. So I think our old guard, if you like, with our innovators who have been on the sidelines for the last 3 or 4 years, they understand that there's a lot of value in the work they've done, and this is the opportunity for that to get out there. I think they also understand, although they're obviously chafing at the bit to get going with innovation again, is that there needed to be that breathing space so that we could show the immense value of the work that had been done. And that again leads itself into, well, what's the next wave of practice changes? If we don't have innovation now, then we're not going to have practice changes to adopt in future. So I hope growers understand, and I'm sure they do, that the opportunity to innovate is something that it's going to be an organic growth path again for the project. It's where it started, and it's gone through 15 or 12 years of innovation, 3 years of practice change, and we need to go back into the next wave of innovation. And I think from what I'm hearing from industry and from government and funders, they're starting to understand that there's only so far you can push the current practices that we've got.
Well, speaking of the future, that's going to be a predominant focus of the upcoming forum in 2024 when we return to our literal roots in the Mackay region. How do you think the growers see the future for themselves, and what role do you think Project Catalyst will play in it moving forward?
Catalyst, I think, will continue to be a highly respected and well recognised foundation or facilitator for the idea of innovation, and as an instrument to be able to connect with other growers to take up those ideas and run with them. As far as the growers themselves are concerned, I think we're at a turning point where we need to see some support from external sources, wherever that may be, of the idea that we need to go back into innovation. I can't speak for the growers themselves, but if I was them, I would be itching to get back to what I love doing before I lose the passion for it altogether.
Many of those foundation growers are moving out of their management positions within their family businesses and passing the reins to the next generation. I've heard from a couple of those growers who've said that their sons are now taking more of a management role. How do we then influence them to take up that banner?
I mean, we see the generations coming through, and we see that at Forum, and I think Forum's probably the best way for the younger generation to be introduced to the Catalyst family and understand what it is that we do and how we do it. We've even seen, people coming in from other industries who have an interest in cane but actually work in completely different agricultural sectors, and it's interesting to see that cross-pollination as well. And it's one thing that growers have always said since I've known them, is that looking over the fence is generally how you can figure out what you think might work next. And they're not talking about the fence to their neighbour, they're talking about the fence to the next industry. So whether it be some mining innovation that might have application in farming, I mean, controlled traffic, for instance, being controlled by GPSs, I mean, that's basically a mining industry tool. That's where that came from, exploration and transport. So, there's a lot of ideas that can be shared. Project Catalyst itself is going to become more reliant on its network of other projects, with whether it's regen ag, whether it's the likes of Odenata or Cultivate Farms. That's where the linkages are going to come in, and that's where we're going to get more access to the younger generation. So we're looking beyond just the families of the growers that we're currently engaged with. We've also got to remember that there's a real shift in dynamics of what a cane farm looks like these days, and we're starting to see quite a large number of farms, smaller farms, that have been taken over by people that aren't familiar with the cane industry, who are coming in, who may have an alternative income, that might work in the mines. We've got the demographics of the ageing grower, we all know that. But we've got this whole new thing that's only sort of really come into play in the last 5 years, where that's something else that we're going to have to work out. How do we engage with those guys? Because they might have smaller farms, but it doesn't mean they can't be productive. I'm really fortunate that I've been given the latitude and the trust by Catchment Solutions to dive in and help growers make Catalyst what they want it to be, and hopefully we can turn the circle back into innovation in the very near future.
Well, we look forward to welcoming everyone to the Mackay region for our Leading Revolutionary Change, Shaping the Future Catalyst Forum from the 18th to the 20th of February. Ross Neivandt, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. I look forward to it.
If you've enjoyed this conversation and would like to hear more stories, please join us on our YouTube channel. You'll find us at Project Catalyst. Also, our website, projectcatalyst.net.au, and our social channels on Facebook and LinkedIn. Project Catalyst is funded by the partnership between the Australian Government's Reef Trust and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, and the Coca-Cola Foundation, with support from WWF Australia.